Hello, this is Gone with Gandalf, and today I am answering the question, how strong was the army of the Elves of Mirkwood? Perhaps you weren't wondering this, but now you are intrigued. So come along for a stroll with Gandalf and listen in on some interesting musings coming up. If you have been watching my campaign from the new version of Divide and Conquer, then you, just as I, may be annoyed at the lack of troops that we currently can muster. And how accurate is that? And how is this reflected in the kingdom during the Lord of the Rings itself? Mirkwood was first inhabited by the elves about 11,000 years before the War of the Ring, and during the period known as the Years of the Trees by elves that departed from Cuivenan, but then they didn't want to cross over the Misty Mountains because they were quite high. Some then stayed in Erungarlen, or Greenwood the Great, and would be known as the branch of Morriquendi called Nandor, or those who turned back. They would have lived their lives here amidst themselves fairly peacefully and would rarely come into contact with other races or elves save for their kin that lived in the woods of LOTR and were also Nandor. Nothing would change in thousands of years till the beginning of the Second Age, where, having lost their lands in Beleriand, lords of the Sindarin elves came east and among the Sylvan elves. They had been in Lindon for long enough now, and they'd had enough. This was around the year 750 of the Second Age, and among these were Orifer and his son Thranduil. Since they were higher in the power hierarchy of elves, they were taken as lords of the Nandor, and Orifer became king of Erungarlen. It wasn't until the end of the Second Age and the War of the Last Alliance do we see any mention of the elves from here going to war and gain any speculation as to their numbers. Orifer commanded the troops reluctantly under the high command of Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor. After all, he had left Lindon so he wouldn't have to listen to that odious elf that brought ruin to his previous home. During the first battle on the Dagorlad, the elves led by Orifer rashly charged into the orcs before Gil-galad and Elendil had called for it, and they were surrounded and pushed back towards the marshes. A similar fate was told of Amdir, the king of Lothlorien, who also died. It was said in the Unfinished Tales that 50% of his force was lost due to this error, and one could estimate the same for Orifer's troops too. Orifer would die, and so would much of his army. There would be further casualties during the 7-year-long campaign, of which this was only the very beginning of. So how many troops did he begin with? I had a forage, and the information on this topic is scarce, and by scarce I mean non-existent officially. Stop watching, or wait. Some wiki sites like to estimate hundreds of thousands of elves were present at the War of the Last Alliance. Keep in mind that elves had already faced a near catastrophic war against Sauron in the War of Sauron and the Elves, imaginative name, and this was only in the 17th century of the Second Age, and how they are generally slow to repopulate, although this is mostly affected, or the areas that were mostly affected were those in Erebor. Not only that, but there's also a constant stream of elves sailing west, having grown weary of Middle-earth, to never return. So, for this reason, I don't know if this is a figure that I could support. However, let's entertain the idea that perhaps there were 200,000 elves combined, which already is a large force. And when you consider the force of Dúnedain was probably greater due to the aforementioned reasoning and larger domain, you have a lot of people and a large army. And considering a medieval setting, which this sort of is in the pseudo-reality, this magnitude has rarely been seen in the real world outside of the 2 world wars. And the First Crusade had 30,000 to 35,000 men involved. For comparison, at a time when Europe had an approximate population of 60 million. But devil's advocate then, and let's say there were 200,000. This would have comprised of Lindon and Rivendell, Lothlorien and Erungarlen. Rivendell is, well, it's like a hamlet really, so they wouldn't have had many. If we attribute a third of the numbers to Lindon, a third to Lorien, and a third to Erungallen, and half of the Sylvan host died in the first battle on the Dagorlad, then the force of Erungallen is already down to just over 30,000. Expand this to include losses of the assault of the Black Gate, 7-year siege of Barad-dûr, and the battle at the foot of Mount Doom, where Sauron almost triumphed, and perhaps under disastrous circumstances this could have fallen to 3,000 to 5,000. We are told that the Sylvan elves were likely equipped compared to the elves of Lindon, or the men of Arnor and Gondor, and they too suffered grievous losses, but they were still far better than the orc rabble. This is maybe a good figure though, but one from which the elves of Erungallen were said to never really recover from, and this is just hinted by their retreat further and further north in the forest, as they couldn't properly use the real estate, essentially. If they had only held a census, then we would know. But we can, however, say that the number of troops that Thranduil marched back to Erungallen in the first year of the Third Age was at least 2,000, but likely a little more. This is because the orc party that was lying in ambush by the banks of the Anduin River, sent north by Sauron to ambush gathering armies of the Alliance, they didn't fancy their chances. It is at this point we could try and guess the number in the remaining host. Again, in the Unfinished Tales, it was said that the orcs that would ambush Isildur saw Thranduil's diminished host, but it was too great in number even then. Isildur would trudge up with a small contingent of Arnorian veterans on his way back to Rivendell, with about 200 men having already sent the bulk of the returning force home on the north-south road. The force of orcs outnumbered the men 10 to 1, thus were about 2,000. So from this we could deem that the returning elves of Thranduil were certainly a match, if not greater than this, small enough to be deemed greatly diminished, but also big enough to deter a force of orcs. With the battles that had gone on, I would provisionally estimate that there would have been a force of 10,000 that marched out of Greenwood, but this is on the low end. A force such as that would have been their maximum wartime capability, and as elves don't reproduce at the same rate as men do, due to their serial longevity, 3,000 years later in the War of the Ring, where they would fight once more, how many would they have been able to muster? Almost 80 years prior to this, there had been the Battle of the Five Armies, which was described in The Hobbit, where many elves perished. Now, the films showed a number of around 10,000, but the book drew to a figure of about 1,000 spears and several hundred archers, which I am going to stipulate that there were 500 to keep the figures nice and round, since several could mean, it could mean anything between 400, plus. As the casualties were also very heavy, then you could say that, let's just say 50%. Again, this part is just me giving an opinion, as there are no concrete numbers on casualties. So there's a force of 750 elves in total, 70 or so years before the War of the Ring, but this is only in this vanguard force. But if I can just back up a moment, the reason I say that the elves are slower to reproduce is that Eldar preferred to raise only one child at a time, and an elf would take 50 years to reach physical maturity. However, they were only considered of age at 100. So if the elves of Mirkwood sought to procreate their way out of this after the events of The Hobbit in 2941, then they could have only had ranks of warriors of about 75 years old. Perhaps, given the severity of the situation, there would have been they could have been drafted in. Indeed, who is to say they didn't already do this for the Last Alliance as well? Even so, only newlywed couples would be involved in this, because elves tend to have children early in their lives, so if you had a particularly old elf who had been married for 1,000 years or so already, he was dead inside, then they would not contribute to the armed forces, or shall we say. So out of the 750-man vanguard that survived the Battle of the Five Armies, you could estimate perhaps a couple hundred young elves to be added to that in the reserve. Additionally, the forces that were at Erebor were never meant to be part of a humongous battle, and they were like a bodyguard against aggression for when Thranduil goes to check out the mountain, and this was in case a few goblins were perhaps holed up in there already. It could be said that the greater force of elves were actually left in Mirkwood because no one saw what was to come. So does anything what I just mentioned have much of a bearing? Well, for this reason, I would look at the estimate of the army that marched to war with the Last Alliance as a guide. In 3,000 years, you would think that the population would have recovered somewhat. However, is the 10,000 that I stated earlier a good guess? From a returning figure of 2,000 to 3,000 in the Alliance, though, you could still conceive that the army was numbered in the region of 20,000 elves at the outset, considering their huge losses that must have otherwise occurred, since they definitely occurred and is one of the few things that is plain. So if we get down to it and think of the forces during the War of the Ring, and extrapolating the vanguard figure of numbers at the Battle of the Five Armies, then you could conceive a figure of 10,000 elves in Mirkwood at the command of Thranduil to defend the realm from the invading orcs in 3019 of the Third Age. Incidentally, this is the size of the army roughly portrayed in the Hobbit films for the scouting party, so just picture that amount maybe. This is, though, 100% speculation and only an estimate. I'm not showing the working and all of the poor evidence and trying to use common sense, but because I added a few fancy words and said it with an English accent, it sounds better. An army of 10,000 during wartime would still require a population far larger, 50,000 perhaps, probably more, and the elves did predominantly live in the Elven King's halls and the surrounding area and didn't go south of the mountains of Mirkwood, so it's not a huge area at all. During the War of the Ring then, Sauron sent a force of orcs to the north where Thranduil's halls were located, and there was the aptly named Battle Under the Trees, which was simultaneous with the battles of Minas Tirith, Dale and Lothlorien. They were of course victorious, but they would perhaps never recover in the Fourth Age, as many would depart the realm, as did Legolas, Thranduil's heir, who dwelt in Ithilien, which is Gondor, and would sail west with Gimli after the death of Aragorn in 120 of the Fourth Age. Galadriel, I believe it was, that said the elves of that land were destined to either sail west or wither and fade into legend, and that the wood would become populated by men of either the woodsman or Dale or Bale of Andwin. So then, to apply this to the Third Age Total War mod, a full banner army of elves is around 2,300 soldiers. If I had all of Erungallen, I could muster a total of 5 armies, I think. At least considering free upkeep in towns and forts, which would reach, about 11,500 troops. So not a bad estimate on that end either. But with this new knowledge, we can be content that the army that I command in my DAC campaign is perhaps not so bad. And if you have been watching that, then you would know that we are turning the tide. And you can click on the playlist, check out the Woodland Realm if it interests you. But if you'd like to see more lore-based content like this, then be sure to let me know in a comment, etc. Because I'm more than happy to make these videos for you. But for now, this has been Gone with Gandalf. Good day!